Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom. Now, I know it's a new year because Michigan won. The truth be told, though, everyone, yesterday was walking around wishing each other Happy New Year, and in my head I keep thinking that was so 3 months ago. Happy New Year was so 3 months ago. Now, people tease me. I often say when I talk to people, I say Happy Secular New Year. I say Happy 2016. Why do I often emphasize that? Happy Secular New Year. We know Rosh Hashanah, we know when it falls. January 1st is 8 days after what date? December 25th. Okay, so think about it. You know what happened December 25th, or you know what others say happened December 25th. 8 days later is January 1st. So that may be why I don't necessarily mark January 1st as the new year, but hey, if Michigan is going to play football, it's a day to celebrate. And yesterday was the day to celebrate. So, nevertheless, since it is the secular new year, it gives us an opportunity to really think and reflect and ask some of life's deeper questions. So I thought I would ask this Shabbat morning a very easy question just to start off, and that is, what is the mission of the Jewish people? It's an easy one. We'll just start off 2016. Nothing heavy. What is the mission of the Jewish people? Tikkun Olam, repairing the world, is the mission of the Jewish people. To be fruitful and multiply is the mission of the Jewish people. Okay, so we have Tikkun Olam, of course, which is part of the Messianic ideal. We talk about it in the Aleinu. That's our Ken Olam Malchut Shaddai. We're supposed to repair the world in God's image. Okay, but if we spend too much time worrying about the rest of the world, we lose ourselves in the process, right? And that's what actually the beginning of Shemot talks about, how the Egyptians were trying to assimilate the Jewish people by changing our names, by doing all sorts of things. And the Jews fought it by keeping their names, by keeping the sense of self. So we have on one hand that part of our mission is Tikkun Olam, is repairing the world. Another part is keeping our sense of self. And maybe that's multiplied by the very first mitzvah given in the Torah, in the book of Genesis, which is Purur Uvu Malua Ta'aretz, right? Be fruitful and multiply and fill up the whole world. So is our entire mission just to have Jewish kids? Not the entire mission. Maybe we have to do something with the kids. But that's certainly part of it. So, yeah.
I think carry on the American leader to be a light.
To be a light unto the nations, right? The prophet Isaiah is the one who challenges the Jewish people to be an Or LaGoyim, to be a light unto the nations. So part of our mission is to be a light unto the nations. So we have to be fruitful and multiply, we have to repair the world, we have to be a light unto the nations. To do mitzvot, right? To do commandments. Rabbi?
Teach the world about the oneness of God and the goodness of God through our actions.
Okay, so, all right, Rabbi Dorite Dude, she's a plan to teach the world about God's oneness, right, through our actions. And this in some way corresponds to being the Or LaGoyim, right, being a light unto the nations. And it also actually ties back into Tikkun Olam, because we know that the Aleinu has everything to do with, on that day, everybody will realize God's oneness. Everyone will realize God's oneness. The door by door, generation to generation. Right? We're supposed to pass on our teachings and our culture from generation to generation. Good. Anything else? So I think we have a couple more hints as to what the mission of the Jewish people is in our Torah portion this morning, Parashat Shemot. And of course, this is really, as I spoke earlier, the foundational Torah portion of it all. This is where God hears the suffering of the Jewish people and decides that the Jewish people, right, it's actually anachronistic to say that, decides that the Israelites are worthy of saving because they have a mission to accomplish. The Israelites are worthy of saving because they have a mission to accomplish. And you're welcome to open with me, if you like, your 8-time Chumashim. I'm on page 328. We're early in the book of Exodus. We're in chapter 3 now, page 328. And here God speaks to Moses at the burning bush. There's all sorts of conversation and discussion as to why God chose Moshe. We see from a variety of other places that Moses is really known for his humility. Right? Moses is the most humble man in Jewish tradition, so he's chosen for the most awesome of tasks. Moses was also somebody who grew up in Pharaoh's court. So he was endowed with a certain intelligence, with a certain leadership. He was trained with a lot more skills than your average slave would have been. We also know he's a Levite, which makes him slightly elevated in the area of holiness. He comes from two very strong parents and has two very strong siblings. So here God has chosen Moses for a variety of reasons. God has also chosen to be the one who frees the slaves, the only Israelite who he himself is free. Think about it for a moment. Of all the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of slaves that existed at the time, who did God choose to free them? The one who is already free. It's an interesting statement, okay? So here God is speaking to Moses at the burning bush. And God introduces God's self to Moses. God says, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And here, if you look to the Hebrew, you have Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov. Right? And our rabbis took those phrases right out of the Torah and put it into our liturgy. The God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Our rabbis explain God could have just said, I am Elohei Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov. Right? I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But why does God say Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov? In order to teach that God has a unique relationship with each and every individual. God had a special relationship with Abraham, different than the relationship with Isaac, different than the relationship with Jacob. So when we daven the Avot, either in Shachrit or in Musaf, and we say Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, we're also referencing the fact that each of us have our own individual, unique relationship with God, just as we are part of this people, Israel. So God introduced himself to Moses, and Moses hides his face, for he was afraid to look at God. God continues, I have marked well the plight of my people in Egypt, and have heeded their outcry because of their taskmaster. Yes, I am mindful of their sufferings. I have come down to rescue them from the Egyptians, and to bring them out of the land to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the region of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Why does God want to bring the people out of their suffering? So far, it just seems to bring them to the promised land. It seems as if God is saying, I owe them through the breach with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, through the covenant I struck with these forefathers, that in their times of greatest distress, I'm going to bring them to the promised land, right? A land flowing with milk and honey. Now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, God says, moreover, I have seen how the Egyptians oppress them. Come therefore, I will send you to Pharaoh, and you shall free my people, the Israelites, from Egypt. And now here's the significant part. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and free the Israelites from Egypt? God said, I'll be with you. That shall be your sign that it was I who sent you. And when you have freed the people from Egypt, you shall worship God at this mountain. Where is Moses right now? Moses had stumbled upon Mount Sinai. He didn't know at the time the significance, so all of a sudden it occurred to him that he was on holy land. So if you remember your Torah, he actually takes off his shoes when he discovers where he is. And in the Torah here, it tells us that he was at Horeb, which is another name for Sinai. So here Moses has this divine encounter at Mount Sinai. And God says to him, you're to go and bring the people Israel out. God's going to bring them to the promised land. But what is Moses' job? He needs to come back to Mount Sinai. Moses needs to come back to Mount Sinai. And he needs to not come back to Mount Sinai alone, but with the entire nation of the people of Israel. So we see here a foreshadowing of what's to come over the next several parshiot as as Moses comes before Pharaoh. And what does Moses proclaim before Pharaoh? When Moses was in Egypt land. But that's not all that Moses says. Moses says, let my people go, that they may worship God. The whole point of the Exodus is to allow the Israelites to come out of their slavery, that they should serve the Lord. So when we talk about the mission of the Jewish people, when we talk about what it is that we're supposed to be doing, we're supposed to be doing Tikkun Olam. We're supposed to be fruitful and multiply. We're supposed to do generation to generation. We're supposed to testify to God's oneness, all because we're the people who came before Mount Sinai, right? The people who were given the mitzvot, the commandments. So the first part of our mission, I might argue, is to serve God. To do whatever it is that God says, that is our mission. That's why God brought us out of slavery, out of Egypt, and ultimately toward the promised land, to give us the mitzvot, to give us the commandments, that we should each and every day, with every ounce of our being, serve God. But I might argue that based on this Torah portion, that's not the only thing that God wants us to do. That is not the exclusive mission of the Jewish people. And we get that hint when we look at the broader scope of what happened at Moses' encounter with God at the burning bush. You remember, as we talked, Moses was a free man. Of course, he grew up in Pharaoh's castle, as it were. And he was free. He was, overlooking the slaves. When he saw two slaves fighting, ultimately he sees a taskmaster beating the slaves. So what does Pharaoh do? What does Moses do? He kills him. Right? He strikes him and kills him. Moses gets nervous. He runs away. Where does he go? He goes to the land of Midian. And there in Midian, he falls in love with a woman. Anyone know what Moses' wife's name was? Zipporah. What was their son's name? Gershom. Very good. All right, we've got a bunch of Torah scholars here. So Moses and Zipporah fall in love. Moses is working for his father-in-law. He went into the family business. Moses' father-in-law's name was Jethro, right? Yitro. So Moses is working in the family business. He's a shepherd. And this, of course, becomes foreshadowing what Moses' job will be for the rest of his life. Just as Moses shepherded sheep, Moses was going to become the shepherd of the Jewish people, right? To lead us to the promised land. So here Moses is shepherding sheep when he comes upon Mount Sinai and has that encounter. And if we flip forward a few pages, we're going to go now to chapter 4. I'm on page 335. Moses has this encounter with God at Mount Sinai, at the burning bush. And of course, God says to Moses, your job, Moses, is to lead the people Israel out of Egypt to the promised land. And you should do it by way of Mount Sinai, that I, God, can give them the commandments. It's a pretty big job. And of course, the pages we just skipped were all about Moses arguing with God, saying, who am I to take on this big job? So here God has given Moshe the most important job in the history of the Jewish people. He's going to be the one who brings millions of people from slavery into freedom. And God himself has given this commandment, this directive to Moses. So what's the very first thing that Moses does? Does he go straight to Pharaoh's palace? No. Does he go straight to the Israelites and say, here's what I'm going to do for you? No. What's the very first thing Moses does upon hearing this directive from God himself? He goes back to his father-in-law. And here Moses goes back to his father-in-law on page 335, chapter 4, verse 18. Moses went back to his father-in-law Jethro and said to him, let me go back to my kinsmen in Egypt and see how they're faring. He doesn't divulge his whole plan. And Jethro said to Moses, Lech l'shalom, go in peace. Now Rashi asks the question, why did Moses go not first to Pharaoh's palace, not to the Israelites, but why did Moses go first back to Jethro, his father-in-law? Because Moses had made an oath that he would work for his father-in-law, that he would take care of his father-in-law's sheep. And so Moses was looking to relieve himself of that oath, and in this way, He does. Jethro says, Lech l'shalom, go in peace, you're good to go, I relieve you of your burden. But there are other commentators who say it differently. Here Moses heard from God himself, directed to go free the Israelites. But Moses doesn't go to Pharaoh first, and Moses doesn't go to the Israelites first. Rather, Moses goes to Jethro to say, do you mind if I go? I know here we were working together, we were in the family business. Do you mind if I go? And these rabbis come to teach something that we've talked about and heard elsewhere, which is Derech Eretz Kadmon LeTorah. Even though God had given Moses himself this directive, Moses used his own sechel, his own mind, to say, what would be the kind thing to do first? What's the Derech Eretz thing to do? It would be to go ask permission from my father-in-law that I should go back to Egypt. That's Derech Eretz. When you respect your father or your mother, or in this case even your father-in-law or your mother-in-law enough, that before you fulfill a directive from God, you go back and you ask their permission. Do you mind, Dad, if I go and save the Jewish people? Is that okay with you? Hopefully Dad will say, Lech l'shalom, go in peace. What is the mission of the Jewish people? The mission of the Jewish people, without question, is to observe the mitzvot, to serve God with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our mind. But the other part of the mission of the Jewish people is to never check our brain at the door in serving God. But we always do so with derech eretz. We use our own mind, our own heart, to reach out to other people, to be kind, to be considerate, to be generous toward others and respectful toward others, perhaps even before fulfilling God's directive. Now, people have asked me over time, if you read the Bible, isn't it just as mean? Isn't it just as harsh? Isn't it just as terrible as other religious sacred texts and what it commands people to do? After all, the Torah commands genocide. The Torah commands stoning stubborn and rebellious sons to death. The Torah commands all sorts of difficult things. But in that God respected Moses' desire to go before his Pharaoh, we also see that God expects us to use our brains to put kindness and compassion toward others first, even before we go and serve God. In this way, God and Moses have set the foundation for the entire literature that is rabbinic literature to follow, the Talmud and the Mishnah, all developed in the diaspora, all developed outside of a seat of power, where when we look at the sacred text of our people, we do so through the eyes of kindness, through the eyes of compassion, through the eyes of knowing what it means to be oppressed, to be enslaved, to be a stranger in someone else's life. So this first Shabbat of 2016, this Shabbat of Parashat Shemot, let us remember and focus and dedicate ourselves this year to truly fulfilling the mission of the Jewish people. To serve God by following the mitzvot, but never to check our brain and our hearts at the door in doing so. The Derech Eretz Kadmon LeTorah, that being a kind and compassionate and a good person comes before Torah, because it is at the very heart of Torah. Cain Yiratzon, may this be God's will. Let us sing together.
Amen.